Okay, so I'm going to hurry up and pop out of YouTube. And just a reminder, when we pop on YouTube, since it's logged in, do not judge the recommended videos, please. Okay, so let me go to share screen really quick because I know that that will help. So we have our homework assignment number 3 in 2 weeks. That's going to be varying the strength of the conditioned stimulus. So we're going to vary the tone intensity there. So we're either going to use a low intensity tone, a medium intensity tone like we are right now, and then a high intensity tone. That is going to be one of the few times that I want you to put in the CS strength mind window. Generally, unless I ask for it, I want white windows. So I want movement ratios, I want suppression ratios, or things like that, because those are referring to actual behavior. So when you're messing around with Sniffy, like I kind of showed you in the video, if it's in blue, it is hypothetical, it's mental. We're going to try to be behaviorists here. So unless I specifically ask for it, don't worry about mind windows. I want you to focus on things like movement ratios. I want you to refer to observable behaviors whenever possible. So make sure you're doing that with acquisition this week. If you're having trouble getting it in, email me. I can work something out with you. And then next week, same thing. We're going to be referring to movement ratios. We're going to do a combined 2 and 3. We're going to do extinction. So whereas with acquisition, we're going to pair that tone with that shock. For exercise 2, you're only going to present the tone. What you should find is that the movement ratio is going to drop. Sniffy's going to start moving more. And then we're going to isolate Sniffy for a day. The method for that in your manual is kind of funny. We're basically going to take Sniffy out of his cage for 1 day and then put him back in and only present the tone. And what you're going to see is a slight little upswing in that movement ratio, and you're going to see that freezing behavior again. So these first 3 are pretty simple. You can use the movement ratios for those. That is totally fine. When we get to varying the CS, I want a mind window, and you're also going to get to create a graph. I already taught you how to export data into Excel, and that's what you're going to need to do for exercise 4. You're going to get to create some pretty graphs. So hopefully that kind of helps a little bit, I hope. I did not get a copyright claim on showing that quick little video from the office, which I'm thrilled about. Not that I would have to do anything. I'm not a monetized channel. I have like 130 subscribers or so. So my channel is not going to be monetized by any stretch, but that's kind of good to know. Okay, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about the work of Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. Isn't it cute? I don't know why it's so sad. Maybe it's because it has the little catheter to kind of measure drops of saliva. So just as a reminder, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, and a lot of his work was related to digestion, gastric juices, different things like that. And so one of the things that he was doing was he was kind of setting up this, apparatus. He was measuring drops of saliva. That information was being set to a recorder that was writing data down on this little strip of paper. And so he was basically seeing how much salivation would result when he presented food. Not because of classical conditioning, but because he was studying salivation, because that is one of the first steps of the digestive response. And what he ended up finding is that the dog eventually started to salivate as soon as it heard its plate of food being put on the floor, before the food was ever presented. And Pavlov kind of realized that there was some sort of preparatory response going on in this case. So Pavlov's rationale was basically this. His rationale was basically that a weak stimulus such as putting a plate on the floor, a simple noise that would normally do nothing on its own, now also elicited salivation. And he believed that this was largely due to conditioned reflexes. And yes, here's a cute little comic. The dog goes to another dog. Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. So, are we conditioning the dogs, or are the dogs conditioning us? Well, I think if it's a cat, we know it's pretty much clear that the cat is basically living in its world and we're just serving it. My cat's gotten into a really bad habit of just like wanting to touch my face while I sleep. It's like, are you okay? I'm like, your claws are out. Please stop. It once clawed me in the lip in the middle of the night. That was awful. Bad cat, bad. Okay, so when we talk about this original classical conditioning paradigm, your textbook, Klein in your textbook basically talked about this in chapter 1, but I'm going to go ahead and reiterate it here. There are 4 major components in classical conditioning, or as your book calls, Pavlovian conditioning. So first of all, we have to have a stimulus that elicits a characteristic reflexive response. This is what is called our unconditioned stimulus. You will occasionally see me refer to this as the US or the UCS. So here's what that means. So when we're talking about something that is based off of a reflex, we are talking about something that is unlearned. So if I put my hand on something hot, what is my first instinct going to be? To take it away. Did anybody teach me how to do that? No, it's a reflex. How many of you have gone to the eye doctor pretty recently? Okay, so Becca, has anybody on Zoom been to the eye doctor pretty recently within the past year? Okay, we got somebody on the chat. Hey, come back, chat. Where are you, chat? I miss you. Where's the chat? Let's go to the participants. Oh, there it is. Emily went to the eye doctor. Okay, so what is the thing that you hate the most about the eye doctor? Becca? Okay, Emily, what is the thing you hate most about the eye doctor? What do you hate about the eye doctor, Emily? Getting my eyes dilated. Okay, yeah, that's pretty bad. Mine has kind of been replaced with a camera that basically makes my eye look like an alien planet being attacked by eyelash monsters. It's a little bit more expensive, but you don't have to worry about having your eyes dilated for hours. Emily? Becca said she didn't like the air puff test. Do you like the air puff test? No, she wrote it in all caps. That is legit. So I'm going to admit something. I actually really like the air puff test. I giggle every time they shoot that puff of air and I go back and I go, I love the air puff test. And I suspect I am the only person on earth who likes that air puff. They have never done that to me. They usually do that to test for things like glaucoma. As you get older, they might test that for you. Just because glaucoma does get more common as you age. But if you're there every year, they're going to try to test it. But what they do, for those who don't know, what they do is you basically put your chin in a little stirrup, and they have you kind of look. Now, at my eye doctor, I'm supposed to basically just look at like a little circle or something like that. And they're like, okay, it's going to shoot a puff of air. And then it just goes poof right into your eye. And then they get the next one. And the idea is to measure the amount of pressure that you have in your eyeball. So what happens when they shoot that puff of air? What is the first thing that happens? You blink. Did anybody teach you to blink when an air puff shoots in your eye? That is an instinct. Your eyeball wants to protect itself. And so that is a case of an unconditioned stimulus. So that reflex, so that blinking to that air puff is an unconditioned response. The pulling your hand away from touching something hot is an unconditioned response. Nobody taught you how to do either of these things. So what really makes classical conditioning work is that we pair stimuli that would do nothing on their own to these reflexive things. That's where it gets its power. So for example, Dr. Gilchrist does not like loud noises. I really don't. I should also mention I've been partially struck by lightning once, and when I was growing up, my house was struck by lightning. Lightning is not my friend, is kind of my whole point. But I also really don't like loud noises. So when there's a thunderstorm and I see a flash of light, I immediately go for this. Why? Because loud noises make me want to cover my ears, or I wince, or I brace myself. But I know, now the flash of lightning on its own is nothing, but because I've had the lightning paired with that loud thunder for so long, anytime I see that flash, I'm going to go, all right, it's coming, the loud noise is coming. So the idea is that this neutral stimulus, this next component, is going to be paired with these in such a way that it's letting us know what's about to arrive. So in Pavlov's case, meat makes you salivate. And it doesn't even have to be meat. Food makes a dog salivate. I trained Smedley with popcorn, which is his favorite thing. It is also my favorite snack, so now it's become his favorite snack. And you can put out a piece of popcorn for him, he'll start drooling like a fountain. Nobody taught him to do that. It's what dogs do in response to food. It's what all animals do. Salivation increases when there's food. So remember that unconditioned, another way to talk about that is unlearned. It is reflexive, it is instinctual. And you do not have to train an animal to do these things. I don't have to train my dog to drool when I give him food. He does a pretty good job of that on his own. So we're going to pair this stimulus that elicits a reflexive response with a stimulus that initially does not do anything, like a tone or a light or a snap. If you've ever clicker trained your dog with a click. So we pair that with a stimulus that normally does not produce an unconditioned response. This is what we refer to as a conditioned stimulus. So in the case of our Sniffy assignment, for those of you who are still working on your lab report, our conditioned stimulus is our medium intensity tone that precedes a foot shock that produces a freezing response. The foot shock is our unconditioned stimulus, and the freezing, it depends. The freezing to the shock is our unconditioned response. But over time, as I pair the tone with the foot shock, tone, foot shock, tone, foot shock, eventually Sniffy's going to get the idea that the tone means that the foot shock's about to happen, and it'll start freezing in response to anticipate that shock. At that point, freezing in response to the tone is a conditioned response. So basically what happens is that the conditioned stimulus, by repeatedly pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually produces a conditioned response all on its own. Does anybody have any questions about this? Because this terminology can be one of the trickier things until we get to some of the theories. Are we feeling pretty good? Excellent. I was in a meeting today and somebody made me the host so I could share something. And when they made me the host, I said, wow, I just felt this unimaginable surge of power. Look, if we're going to keep doing Zoom, we might as well have a little bit of fun with it. I was going to say, if you look at the filters, you can give yourself a mustache and makeup and make your eyebrows like really Instagrammy. Okay.
Dr. Cole learned there's filters on Zoom on Monday, and it was really funny.
Oh, nice. We learned about those in trivia.
Okay, I was about to be like,
Okay. All right, so going with Pavlov's experiment, let's try to identify some of these components. So what is the food? Is it a conditioned stimulus, an unconditioned stimulus, a conditioned response, or an unconditioned response? What is the food?
Unconditioned stimulus.
Food is an unconditioned stimulus. That is absolutely right. Good job, Phoebe. Now, what about the bell or the tone? Does that normally do anything on its own? No? So what would that be?
Conditioned stimulus.
Yep, our tone or our bell is going to be our conditioned stimulus. So we're going to pair the bell or the tone. That's going to come first, and then the food comes next. So the idea is the bell signals to the dog that the food is about to arrive. Okay, so what is our response when we are salivating or the dog is salivating in response to the bell or the tone? Is that a conditioned response or an unconditioned response? Let's get somebody on Zoom, since there's more people on Zoom than in person today. Okay, we got in the chat. Where's the chat? Come back, chat. Where are you? I gotta wait a minute. Where's the chat? I'm so worried. Where's the chat? Oh gosh. Oh, there it is. Oh, there we go. Both Emily and Geneva said conditioned response. That is absolutely right. So that would be our conditioned response. So yes. And don't worry, we have a cute picture of a dog coming up. Now, salivating in response to food, that is reflexive. So in that case, that's going to be our unconditioned stimulus. So here's a really cute picture of a drooly dog. Ain't he cute? So here's what happens before conditioning. So here we have our unconditioned stimulus of food in the dog's mouth that is producing the reflexive unconditioned response of salivating. Now compare that with our tone, which in this case produces nothing. Then we're going to repeatedly pair our conditioned stimulus, our tone, with our food, our unconditioned stimulus, and that will again produce drooling. Once this has been put together with the tone and the food a sufficient number of times, the dog will begin to salivate in response to the tone. Get back there. And so make sure that you understand the distinction between a conditioned stimulus, an unconditioned stimulus, a conditioned response, and an unconditioned response. I can promise you there will be questions on the exam, on your first exam, where you will have to be able to identify each from examples. And remember that those exams are online and they are open book and open note. I mean, I'd prefer if you didn't go to Chegg. I've been hearing a lot of bad stuff about Chegg lately. Go to Chegg for your textbooks. Don't go to Chegg to cheat. If you have any questions on this, let me know, but just be prepared to be able to identify those 4 different components from examples. I like to do that, so I'm telling you now. This can be one of the trickier parts, so I really want to make sure that you learn it. Okay, so here's kind of what that looks like. We're going to look at a lot of figures like this, so I want to kind of get you a little bit acclimated to them. So here's the classic Pavlov procedure. And so what I want you to kind of pay attention to is how this is set up. So we identify our conditioned stimulus as the bell. You can see that the bell, in terms of the timeline, occurs right before the food presentation. which produces the unconditioned response of salivating to food. Later on, we have the exact same setup, but notice that we have a conditioned response to the bell along with our unconditioned response to the food. So get kind of used to looking at these kind of diagrams. You will not need to know them for an exam, but I'm going to show you a lot of diagrams that look like this. So just be prepared, and I'll try to walk you through what all the pictures mean. So there are a lot of different ways that classical conditioning has been used to do animal research and also research with humans. So your book talks about a few. I added a couple, and there are a couple that your book don't talk about. So I kind of combined a little bit. So these are some very basic classical conditioning procedures. These are what are known as preparations. And by the way, here's a hint. You might have, for an essay question or a short answer question, you might have to pick one of these preparations and talk about them. So hint, hint. If I tell you hint, hint, it probably means it's pretty serious. See, I like not wearing glasses. You can actually see my eyebrows do things. But it's kind of clear most of my facial expressions involve my mouth, and there's nothing I can do about that. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is eye blink conditioning. And we're going to watch a video where somebody actually does eye blink conditioning with a straw. Okay, so eye blink conditioning, it's very much like that air puff test that we talked about. So a puff of air to the eye is an unconditioned stimulus, and it always produces an unconditioned response of blinking in response to that air puff. Your eyes are super duper sensitive, and if you've ever gotten like sand or makeup, or if you've ever scratched your cornea, you know that your eyeball is super sensitive. So one of the ways that your body tries to protect itself is that if you get a puff of air in your eye, you're gonna blink. So we can pair the air puff, our unconditioned stimulus, with a conditioned stimulus of either a light or a tone. So we're going to do a light or a tone, and then the air puff. Light or tone, and then the air puff. And eventually what should happen is that if this works well, you will begin to blink in response to either the light or the tone. Now, here's the thing about this kind of classical conditioning preparation. The conditioned response is noticeably smaller than the unconditioned response. So you're not going to get as strong of a blink to the tone as you would with an air puff. And that's because a tone is a heck of a lot less aversive than an air puff is. Like, just the fact that many of you talk about that air puff test at the eye doctor with just burning hatred. Emily used all caps, y'all. You don't do that for something that you're just like meh about. You just don't. So the conditioned response is often going to be smaller, and it occurs very slowly. This is not a very robust response. To get this kind of conditioning, many different pairings are required, and even then, it may only show up half the time. So for behavior modification, maybe don't do something like this because the odds are pretty good you're not going to get anything out of it. You can kind of see eye blink conditioning is actually pretty common with rabbits. Rabbits have very, very sensitive eyes and very, very sensitive blink reflexes. Eye blink conditioning works very well with them. It's been used in a variety of different types of research with rabbits to look at things like aging, mapping of different portions of the brain, particularly the cerebellum in a rabbit, and so on. So really quick, we're going to go ahead and watch a video of eye blink conditioning. And by the way, I will tell you, this video is like very 80s-tastic, so be prepared. We're going to watch a lot of 80s-tastic videos this semester. And I did check these links to make sure they worked.
Okay, as you can see, Howard has got a straw pointing at his eye, and via a long set of straws that are taped together, it comes to a blue bulb on my desk over here. And if I squeeze the bulb, Howard has to blink. And I guess let's go to our split screen here. Because the air is puffing into his eye. And we've got him turned in such a way that he can't see the blue bulb. Now, from classical conditioning, we could expect that since what we have here is a reflex, that whenever the air puffs, that he should blink, right? Really has no choice over that. But let's suppose, and this may take more coordination than I have. Remember Jerry Ford, President Ford, trying to walk and chew gum at the same time? And I'm going to try and use a pencil tap here and pair that with the puff of air enough times, and then let's eventually see what happens.
Blink to the knob.
See what happened?
That's the 80s. Oh, I'll tell you all the things that I like about it in a minute. Whoa. Okay, so we saw our acquisition trials where you are repeatedly pairing the knock on the table with the air puff. And then you saw extinction trials where you were basically just presenting the knock. Now notice that this man in this instance did blink to the knock. If we had repeatedly been doing that knock over and over with no air puff, what will eventually happen? He'll stop blinking. So I would like to say that's a very 80s-tastic video. It looks like somebody's cable access TV show. The 80 things. Phoebe mentioned the headband. I would also like to mention the big chunky ring.
Oh, yeah.
The big chunky class ring. Yeah, I have a class ring. My class ring doesn't look like that. I have a high school class ring. My mom thought it would be nice for me to have. And then it turned out my fingers couldn't fit. They're too tiny now. So it just sits in my jewelry box. But that's a big old ring. I'm just saying. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is condition suppression. Look what example I used. It's the sneezy. So condition suppression, basically the idea here is that we are trying to suppress some type of behavior through the principles of classical conditioning. You could also potentially argue that the type of acquisition that we are doing with Snippy right now is fear conditioning. So in this case, our unconditioned stimulus is an aversive stimulus of some kind. In this case, it's a foot shock. It could also be a really loud noise. Both of those are commonly used as aversive stimuli, either very loud, unpleasant noises or shocks. Depending on the stimulus type, the unconditioned response could be things like jumping. And by the way, we are going to see that with Snippy. In operant conditioning, we are going to give him a big punishment, and he is going to jump. There could be flinching. What's most common is a freezing response, so not moving. So for example, In our first exercise with acquisition, you're going to know that Snippy has learned to associate the tone with the shock when he moves less, and his movement ratio goes up because he's moving less. So remember, and I will keep repeating it, because it doesn't make if you don't know what the movement ratio is made up of, it won't make a lot of sense, because when you hear movement ratio, you think higher, more movement, but it's actually the opposite. The higher your movement ratio is, the more freezing that is happening. So we're mostly going to be looking for that freezing response. Our conditioned stimulus is any neutral stimulus. It could be a tone, it could be a light, it could be things like that. Now, typically in a conditioned suppression paradigm or preparation, it's going to be of a long duration, but it's typically going to be less than a minute. The unconditioned stimulus, like the shock or the burst of noise, will follow immediately after, and it will tend to be shortened. So conditioned suppression, we know that it is working when we see a reduction in the target behavior when the conditioned stimulus is present. So that could mean, for example, in exercise 1, more freezing in response to the tone. If we had trained Snippy to press a bar, we would see less bar pressing when we present the tone, or things like that. So we're basically noticing that we've learned something, that something has been learned in this preparation by a reduction in the target behavior, whether that is bar pressing or moving or some other target behavior. Okay, does anybody need some more time here or have any questions? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this conditioned stimulus. So when we do conditioned suppression, so I mentioned that with eye blink conditioning, it's really hard to get. Conditioned suppression is really easy to get. We actually see that when we pair something like a tone or a light with something like a foot shock, which you kind of see here in this cute little cartoon, that we get rapid behavioral suppression. You're going to see Snippy move less in 10 trials, and you'll actually start to see a change in fewer trials than that. Why do we have such rapid behavioral suppression here? What's going on that makes that learning much more quickly? Foot shocks hurt. That is exactly right. So foot shocks hurt. Pain is a very powerful teacher. So y'all are probably going to get sick of me using examples of Smedley. You're like, no, we're not. Okay, so one thing that you need to know about Smedley is that he is not allowed to have room privileges in the back rooms of the house. He is not allowed in the bathroom. That's where the cat is. That's where the cat eats. He is not allowed in the hallway. That's where the litter box is. He's not allowed in the bedroom, ever. He hasn't been in the bedroom since he was a puppy and he needed to whine to us to take him out to the bathroom before he was housebroken. So he's not allowed in those back rooms. And it is in his nature to want to explore. So it kind of turned out to be pretty interesting. We got this thing called a scat mat. The scat mat was originally meant for my cat because I did not want my cat scratching at the door in the morning to wake me up. I wanted to sleep. And so this little scat mat is wired with a little bit of electricity. It's not painful. I have stepped on it plenty of times. It is not pleasant, but it's not painful. And it does deliver a little bit of an electrical pulse to the feet. So it didn't really work very well on the cat because the cat's smart and the cat can jump over it, but it works really well on Smedley. So we put it at the front of the hallway, and Smedley knows not to go in there. Unfortunately, and really, it only took him being shocked once for him to learn that, because that pain is aversive stimuli are really powerful teachers. We learn a lot from negative stimuli. Unfortunately, the battery died. It hasn't shocked anybody in a while, and he's starting to get braver about going into the hallway, and it hit me that I'm going to need to buy a new battery, because we don't want him going and eating the cat's food. That's for the cat. So rapid behavioral suppression works with conditioned suppression because aversive stimuli, we tend to learn a lot from pain, and we generally want to avoid it. So it takes us less trials to learn in these kinds of situations. Now, when we're looking at this with Sniffy, we're going to be looking at the CS response strength window to tell us about this. And additionally, we're going to be looking at the movement ratio or the suppression ratio windows. So be prepared for those when we do them. The next thing we're going to talk about is a skin conductance response, which used to be referred to as a galvanic skin response. Kind of like the ones that you see here. Occasionally, skin conductance responses are what are used in polygraph and lie detector tests, like the one in Meet the Parents. I went to the movie theater to see Meet the Parents with my sister, and I spent the whole time feeling bad for this poor guy. I'm like, it's just one bad thing. Like, I don't enjoy watching somebody just have bad things happen to them over and over again. I just don't. So here's something kind of interesting. Who here is not a very sweaty person? I don't really sweat much. Okay, so what if I told you that you might actually sweat a little bit more than you think? It's just not at a level that is super perceptible. So when you're scared, when you're anxious about something, when you're excited about something, you get these tiny little microscopic changes in perspiration. And so you get these tiny little changes in perspiration, which actually changes the electrical conductivity in your skin that can be picked up and measured. So that's kind of how lie detector tests work, but there's not really a lot of trust in lie detector tests. Like if Maury Povich can do them, the lie detector test determined that was a lie. You may not be able to put a lot of faith in them. But the idea here is that you have all of these different points with electrodes, and they're going to measure changes in that skin conductance due to microperspiration. So we can actually set this up with classical conditioning, and we will watch a quick video about the skin conductance response in a bit. So here, our unconditioned stimulus is an electrical shock. That is going to create a small little change in skin conductance that can be picked up. Now here's what's really interesting. If we pair a tone or some other complex stimulus like music or an image with that electrical shock, eventually presenting either the tone or the stimulus on its own will be enough to produce that change in skin conductivity. And what's actually kind of interesting about this, even though I don't trust lie detector tests or polygraph tests any further than I can throw them, if we're doing classical conditioning with a skin conductance response, it's actually pretty good. The conditioning is very, very reliable, and it's very, very quick. So let's watch a quick video on skin conductance.
This video is part of a project for the Element 14 community, the electronics and engineering community where you can connect and collaborate with top engineers from around the world. Join now at element14.com, link in the doobly-doo. Greetings, programs. Atari here, you there, and have you ever had that...
We're not watching all 8 minutes of this.
that feeling where you see this beautiful angelic creature and you just get a little sweaty
They're
in the
cupids
palms and you
hearts.
just sort of feel all tingly all over? Well, there is actually a name for that, and it's called electrodermal activity, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Hey, baby, if you like making electrical connections, screwing around, job. Why don't you click that subscribe button?
They all have to do this.
Go ahead and ring my bell so you don't miss anything. Now let's get it on. So there's this phenomena that describes the property of human skin to have this sort of continuous variation in electrical characteristics. And it's been studied for so long, like 170 years-ish. And over the years, it has had all these different names, like skin conductance, galvanic skin response,
That's the one I heard.
electrodermal response, psychogalvanic reflex,
Okay, that's hot.
skin conductance response, sympathetic skin response, and skin conductance level. Basically, it all describes this same phenomenon about the electrical conductivity in human skin. And so finally, because everything has to have 80 different names, finally everybody just kind of got together and decided on one standard name. They're going to call it Electrodermal Activity,
Not
or
me.
EDA. So the EDA theory states that basically skin resistance varies with the state of the sweat glands in the skin. So sweating is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, which is all the brain functions or nervous system functions that you don't actually think about. And the sympathetic nervous system is basically your fight or flight response. So it's the one that controls, like, when all the adrenaline gets surged into your bloodstream, your pupils dilate and you get sweaty and you're ready to, like, you know, take on the world or just run from it, which is pretty much me every day. Hashtag anxiety disorder.
Yep.
So the level of skin conductance is sort of a proxy for your level of, like,
Arousal.
physiological or psychological arousal. So the theory states then that if you are aroused in that certain way, then you are going to be, your sweat glands are going to produce more perspiration, and thus you are going to have a higher level of skin conductance. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Now there's more to it, obviously, than this, but this is kind of what we're looking at, you know, in the popular science kind of breakdown of this phenomenon.
Okay, we can learn a brief history. Maybe
In
we will watch all of
1849,
this.
this guy, Emile Heinrich Dubois-Lemont, who's German, but I pronounce it with a French accent because Dubois, I don't know. Anyway, he is experimenting in his lab, and he discovers that when he immerses the limbs of his test subjects in a solution, specifically zinc sulfate, he finds that electric current is flowing from the limb with the muscles contracted to the limb with the ones that are relaxed. Ach, yoika! There is some kind of musculoskeletal electrical connection going on. He kind of plays with that for a while. Now, flash forward about 30 years, 1878, Switzerland, they figured out that, hey, if you're nervous, you're going to sweat, and sweat causes your body to be more electrically conductive. Then we flash forward another 20 some odd years, and then we've got actual scientifical type studies of this galvanic skin response. Carl Jung actually was talking about this in his Studies in World Analysis book in 1906. He attached electrodes to the palms of his test subjects and then would play, like, word association with them and then measure their response for arousal. Now, like 100 years later, we're looking into the 1970s at this point. There's more than 1,500 articles written about what is now collectively referred to as electrodermal activity, or EDA. It's becoming kind of a mainstream thing. So, what are the problems with measuring electrodermal activity in a scientific capacity? For one, it all depends on A, the person, B, it depends on the environment as well, because you see, this environment is fairly dry. Thus, I'm not going to have super high EDA kind of response here. It all depends on temperature, it depends on humidity.
Y'all, we're going on a field trip to Florida so we can get our skin conductance responses.
Hell, it depends on what the person eats. It depends on if they're taking any sort of medications that messes with their pH levels, their natural like pH levels. If they're a little more acidic or a little more alkaline, that can affect EDA responses. You have a lot of variables that go on, not to mention like the different sides of, like if you put electrodes on my right hand versus my left and you give me different stimuli, one side might be more reactive than the other just because of the part of the brain that controls that response, that particular area. There are so many problems with using this as an end-all beat-all kind of litmus test, if you will. There's too many false positives that come from studying EDA. Now, we can look at it in context with other things and say, yeah, there's certain trends, but it is not the end-all beat-all that a lot of people put stock in.
So yeah, don't use it as a lie detector test, y'all. Okay, so when that goes up on YouTube, again, I will have to check and see about copyright claim. If I have to briefly take it down once I send you the link, I may have to trim it out. So if you're waiting for the video and it turns out it gets blocked later tonight, just give it a couple of hours. I'm going to trim the segment if they flag it, and I'll take care of it. So yeah, don't use this for your lie detector test. Now, your book talks about something that I've actually never really talked about in class before. So these are not in your slides, but I didn't add too many. But I thought I would add this. So I'm going to start by talking about something that I miss. And I'm going to preface this with, this story has a point. I always preface that with, this story has a point. So for those of you who may not know, I'm pretty actively, or up until the pandemic, I was pretty involved with the community theater in Nevada. And I was not only somebody who acted in many different productions, I am also, at least as far as I know, because we haven't met in a while, I am still on the board of directors. And in particular, my job is to check on the house. So it's my job to get people, volunteers to take tickets, sell tickets, and I help out with the concession stands. So if I'm not in a play, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be working behind the concessions counter, making popcorn and selling candy and things like that. And here's one of the things that I have discovered. A little trick to get people to buy more popcorn. So we sell before the show, and then we sell at intermission. So around intermission, like maybe 10 minutes before intermission, I start making a batch of popcorn. Why do I start making a batch of popcorn then? So the people in the theater can smell it, because you know what happens when you smell really good popcorn? It makes you want to buy some. So that is kind of the point to my story, that different contextual and environmental cues can be really powerful cues for stimulating hunger. So research has actually found that exposure to a food-related context, so this would function as a conditioned stimulus, as well as the taste and the smell of food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, can actually prime hunger and motivate eating behavior. So the smell of popcorn is not a conditioned stimulus. If you smell hot, buttery popcorn, you're probably going to get pretty hungry for popcorn. I know I do. So that is an unconditioned stimulus. But if I showed you a picture of some fries and a big juicy, well, for those of you that eat meat, a big juicy cheeseburger. For vegetarians and vegans, I'll show you some delicious salty French fries. I'm a sucker for a good French fry. So that is what we call a food-related context. On its own, a picture of food or talking about food is not going to make you hungry. But when these are repeatedly paired with the smell of food and the taste of food, those can basically create conditioned responses of hunger. Now, in this case, our unconditioned response are going to include behaviors that basically prime and motivate eating, including salivation, gastric secretions, and changes in insulin levels. Changes in insulin levels often stimulate us to eat. So what can happen is that we can be in one of these situations where we're looking at a picture of a cheeseburger or potentially listening to Jimmy Buffett's Cheeseburger in Paradise. And that will create changes in salivation, gastric secretion, and changes in insulin. Okay, so what's interesting is that your textbook actually kind of notes that this even works, like this food priming, this hunger priming, can actually even work when rats and mice have already been fed and are no longer hungry. So from page 43 in your textbook, let me see. Food consumption in satiated rats has been conditioned to a discrete stimulus such as a tone. So they pair a tone with food in this instance, or to a distinctive contextual environment. In these studies, either the discrete or contextual stimulus was initially paired with food delivery in food-deprived hungry rats. These cues were then presented prior to food availability in satiated rats, which means they were full, they'd already eaten. The presence of these environmental events elicited eating even though the rats were no longer hungry. Interestingly enough, on the same page, Rapucci and Petrovich found that exposure to food-related cues motivated excessive food consumption in satiated rats for over a 4-hour period, and excessive food intake continued for a second test day. So kind of think about if you've ever had, or if you're thinking about taking sensation and perception with me at some point, we do talk about hunger and taste and eating behavior. Food advertising is rampant. Food advertising is rampant. One of the things that I know, at least growing up when I was a kid, I remember seeing advertisements for McDonald's, for juice drinks, for cookies, for cereals, and things like that. Those food advertisements are not only designed to get you to spend money, but they're also going to make you hungry and potentially even lead to an excessive food intake. And this doesn't just work with rats, as I've kind of denoted, this works with humans too. Generally, any visual or auditory cues associated with food will do this, and it also increases our eating behavior. What's interesting is that this is especially true for chocolate. So I have to share this because this is really interesting. So the elicitation of eating behavior by environmental events has also been reported in humans. Birch, McPhee, Sullivan, and Johnson presented visual and auditory stimuli, as I mentioned, on some days and with food to hungry children, and then auditory stimuli and visual stimuli without food on other days. On test days, the children were satiated and the cues associated with food or those stimuli not previously paired with food were presented. Stimuli associated with food led to greater snack consumption in children who were already full. So things like these advertisements can actually produce overeating in anybody. But here's what's interesting. Ridley, Siegert, Kronberg, and Yeomans found visual stimuli associated with chocolate increased food consumption in adult human subjects significantly more than food consumption to visual stimuli associated with chips, and even more than to non-food related visual stimuli. So chocolate in particular seems to be something, and I'm like, I don't get it. Like, I don't mind chocolate, but I'd rather have chips. Like, I'm the weird, no, I take that back. You know what I'd rather have? Chocolate covered potato chips. So I will have my chocolate and my chips. So yeah, chocolate is an interesting one. So speaking of food, does anybody here have a food that they absolutely will not eat? And I'm going to start by asking the people on Zoom. So go ahead and type in the chat what food you absolutely will never eat. Tell me what food you will not eat. Boop. Eat. What is a food you will not eat? Calamari. Okay. Emily, my question to you is anything that has a bunch of fat on it, okay? All right. So here's my question for both of you since you mentioned those. Have you gotten sick from eating those foods before? So Emily, have you gotten sick from calamari? Geneva, have you ever gotten sick from food that had a bunch of fat on it?
No, but my mom told me it was chicken, and I ate it thinking it was chicken, and literally it was the most disgusting thing I put in my mouth, and I spit it out, and I have never wanted to try it since.
Y'all, no good comes from lies. That is the moral of that story. Geneva, have you ever gotten sick from food that had a bunch of fat on it? Hello? Oop, my mic is still working. I always get nervous when I turn off the computer. Okay, so let me ask the people in class. Is there a food that you will not eat?
Blue cheese.
Huh? Okay, you first.
Blue cheese.
Blue
And
cheese.
oatmeal.
And oatmeal.
Like hot oatmeal.
I love oatmeal.
My whole family, except for my oldest brother, like, can I eat oatmeal? I can't eat oatmeal. I can make oatmeal.
Is it a texture thing?
It's a texture.
Oh, okay,
Like,
yeah.
I love oatmeal cookies, but like hot oatmeal.
My favorite breakfast is cooked oatmeal on the stovetop. Huh? Oh, Ashley added blue cheese. Okay. Okay, we got a texture issue. Ashley, did you get sick from blue cheese? Did you get sick?
No, but one time I got sick from eating cold SpaghettiOs.
Did you not eat those for a while?
Yeah.
Probably a good idea.
I've never gotten sick from blue cheese. It's just once I smell it, or like I put it in my mouth, it's just not a taste that I like. So I'll usually spit it out.
I would expect that if you didn't like blue cheese, you probably also do not like strong cheeses like gorgonzola, and I love me some gorgonzola. I don't really eat cheese anymore, obviously, but I love those strong cheeses that go with chicken wings. I used to love those. Becca, tuna, have you gotten sick from tuna?
No, but I had never really eaten it before, and I went to like a survival summer camp.
Okay.
It was like all we ate for a week practically.
That'd do it. Okay, so here's part of the reason that I'm bringing this up, and here's part of the reason why I keep asking you, did you get sick? Did you get sick? So there's a really well-documented finding that when we get sick from eating a food, there's going to be a period of time where we do not want that food. So let me tell you a quick little story. I will tell you a quick story. There was a very, very long time where I would not eat. This is back in my pre-vegan days, of course. There was a period of about maybe 15 years where I did not eat prime rib. So I went to dinner with my stepfather and my sister. He used to take us out to dinner like once a week or every other week or something like that after he split up with my mom, which was nice of him. And so we went to a place, and I'd never had prime rib, so I got prime rib with some broccoli. And it was pretty good. It came with horseradish, and I love horseradish. I also love wasabi and stuff like that, which is based off of horseradish. So I had prime rib, I had some broccoli, and then we went for ice cream later, and I had ice cream. And a couple of hours later, I laid down for a nap, and when I woke up, I immediately got up and was hugging the toilet and just not feeling very good. And I did not eat prime rib for a very long time after that. Now, one of the things that we will find is that when you get sick from a food, and here's what's really critical, it has to be a food that is relatively new or is one that you don't eat much. So I think it's interesting, Becca, you didn't get sick from tuna, but you mentioned that you hadn't really had it before. Novelty is going to be really critical here. So here's what's interesting about my story. The new thing that I'd had was prime rib. I eat broccoli all the time. If broccoli made me sick, my brain would say, it's not the broccoli, you have broccoli all the time. If I got sick off of the ice cream, my brain would go, it's not the ice cream, you have ice cream all the time, but we got this new thing, and your brain's like, it's that one's fault. It's not the other foods that you've eaten, it's the new food that you tried. So our brain kind of goes, this new food is what made us sick, so we end up getting an aversion to that. So think about some times where you've gotten sick. So Ashley mentioned cold SpaghettiOs. Yeah, that'd definitely keep me from eating SpaghettiOs for a while. So this is kind of cool because taste aversion is not only something that happens inside of the laboratory, it's something that happens in real life, and it's something that we can all relate to. I got sick off of food at Panera, and I love Panera, and my partner said, oh no, you're liable to starve now. I didn't eat at Panera for a while after that. So here, our conditioned stimulus is the taste of a food or a drink. So here's what's really critical. Now, what could have made me sick at that restaurant? It may not have been the food at all. There might have been something in the water glass or something on the silverware that made me sick, but your brain goes to the novel taste. We are very, very quick to associate illness with something that we ate. And that's going to be really interesting. So what we find is that it typically has to be something we don't normally eat. It has to be something novel. So if I got sick from eating a piece of pizza or a peanut butter sandwich, I'm probably not going to do this because I eat peanut butter all the time. It is like my favorite food. So our conditioned stimulus is a novel taste of a food or a drink. Your book calls this flavor aversion. Our unconditioned stimulus is an induced illness after our conditioned stimulus. So in the laboratory, what this is going to look like is we're going to give a rat a novel taste. In this case, usually what we do is we give it water that's been treated with saccharin. We don't usually give rats sweet water to drink. So for them, it's novel, they're going to love it, and they're going to drink it. So then what we do with some of those rats, we inject them with a drug that will make them sick, that will make them nauseous. So we induce an illness. That is our unconditioned stimulus, the illness. And that produces the conditioned response of the animal not eating the food following illness. It's possible that being near that food or smelling that food or tasting that food could make them sick, just like the induced illness did. Now, what's interesting about this is that if we do a sweet taste that causes nausea, that leads to taste aversion. We are very quick to associate a novel taste with illness. If we, instead of injecting them with a drug that makes them nauseous, if we give them a foot shock, they don't develop taste aversion. They don't. It's only when you make them nauseous. Now, on the other hand, if they drink water and the cage is set up so that they hear a click while they drink the water, if you give them nausea, it doesn't teach them aversion to drinking the water. But if you get a foot shock, they're going to avoid drinking that water again. Not because of taste aversion, they're actually going to freeze up. So we're more likely to associate physical pain with something outside of ourselves. We're more likely to associate novel tastes of food or drink with illness or pain that is inside of ourselves. So because we are more readily associating illness with taste, some people have actually argued that taste aversion is not technically classical conditioning because we have a biological predisposition to associate illness with taste. So there's actually some debate about whether or not flavor aversion is classical conditioning. There is some debate about this. And Ashley, I'm sorry that there's spaghetti right here. I genuinely did not know about your SpaghettiOs.
It's okay.
By the way, I would also argue taste aversion may not only occur with illness. There was a period of time where I would not eat hot dogs because my cousin ate a bunch of hot dogs and threw up in the car, and I had to smell hot dog vomit.
That kind of thing has happened.
Huh?
Not the hot dogs, but a similar kind of thing with food.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't even have to be an illness. Sometimes it's just somebody else's illness around you, and the smell of that illness is enough to do it.
I don't think my family has had pesto pasta since then. We've had creamy pesto pasta. We haven't had just plain pesto pasta.
You're missing out. You know it's just basil, right? I mean, it's basil and walnuts and other things.
It's
but
the memory.
I know, I'm giving you a hard time. So here's part of the reason why some people debate that taste aversion is not actually classical conditioning. It's because you don't require a lot of repeated trials to get it. This is an instance where you get this after one trial of learning. And unlike a lot of other classical conditioning preparations that we've talked about here, taste aversion can last for years. I did not touch prime rib for years.
But doesn't it not work for alcohol?
I don't know about alcohol. I will have to look that up.
So I remember we talked about people who are trying to give up drinking.
Oh, antabuse. Yeah, antabuse. Antabuse works for some people, but don't forget that alcohol addiction is not just about taste and flavor. And also, not everybody drinks alcohol for the taste. Like, there is a reason that alcohol like Everclear exists, and I don't think people drink that because of how it tastes. Let's just say that. But taste aversion can last for years. You can learn it after one trial, and it's very, very powerful. And there's not a lot of other classical conditioning preparations that can do that. And so for that reason, some people actually argue that taste aversion is not truly classical conditioning. All right, everybody good? Now think about all the foods you really like to get out of your mind, all the foods you hate. Okay, so we're only going to do a couple of slides, maybe a slide or two, and we'll talk about this next week. So we're going to start by talking about some of the theories behind classical conditioning and how it works. So we're going to talk about Pavlov's original idea of how he thought classical conditioning happened, what he calls stimulus substitution. And then we're going to talk about the work of Rescorla. And we're going to come back to Rescorla quite a bit. I like the work of Rescorla. But we're going to talk about the ideas behind why classical conditioning happens. okay? So Pavlov's idea behind classical conditioning was what we sometimes refer to as stimulus substitution. So basically what's happening is that when I pair my conditioned stimulus like a tone or a tone and an unconditioned stimulus such as meat, that repeated pairing allows, according to Pavlov, the conditioned stimulus to basically become a surrogate or a substitute for the unconditioned stimulus. So basically, tone becomes the new food. And I'm kind of like, when you hear that, it sounds kind of silly because you're like, you can't eat a tone. You're right, you cannot. So the idea is that because the conditioned stimulus has basically become a substitute for the unconditioned stimulus, it takes on all of the responses associated with the unconditioned stimulus, which is why it produces the same responses. So it leads to our conditioned stimulus eliciting the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. And that's part of the reason why the only thing that really separates the unconditioned response and the conditioned response is what you are responding to. So in the case of Pavlov's original study, salivating is the same in both the conditioned response and the unconditioned response. What is differing is what you are salivating to. In the case of the unconditioned response, you're salivating to food. In the case of the conditioned response, you're salivating to the tone. And so Pavlov believed that basically what's happening is that our CS is taking on the properties of our US. There's a problem with this though. So when we're talking about this, when we looked at eye blink conditioning, one of the things that I mentioned is that the conditioned response, the eye blink to the tone, is never as strong, and sometimes it doesn't even show up, compared to the eye blink associated with the air puff. If the conditioned stimulus is a perfect unconditioned stimulus substitute, we should see similar strength in our response, right? But we're not getting that here. So the conditioned response doesn't always perfectly replicate the unconditioned response. The other thing is that not all of the parts of the unconditioned response become part of the conditioned response. So let's go back to taste aversion. Our unconditioned response, so when we're talking about food that we're eating, usually if we get sick because of food, it's usually because of, oh, we are almost out of time. It's because of a virus or something like that, something that makes us sick. And we have the unconditioned response of vomiting or becoming very sick to our stomach. Now, when we have taste aversion, I don't necessarily throw up every time I look at prime rib. So one of the things that we're going to find is that not all of the parts of the unconditioned response become part of the conditioned response or vice versa. We'll talk some more about this next time. Your Snippy assignments are due tomorrow at 5 o'clock. If you're having trouble getting those in, just let me know. But folks, have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the slightly warmer weather. Make good decisions. Don't lick doorknobs. And I will see you here next time. Take care, everybody. Stay away from those foods you hate.
Thanks, Dr. G.
You are very welcome. Have a good weekend.
Bye.